the History of the World podcast, written and presented by Chris Hasler. This episode is a special episode on the subject of easy company. E Company were associated with the American paratroopers during World War II. Paratrooping was a relatively new innovation in warfare that involved using aircraft to drop parachutists behind enemy lines. The idea of dropping soldiers from the air behind enemy lines existed long before the Second World War, but it was during the Second World War that it became a significant practical reality. The Germans were the first to start using paratroopers on a large scale in 1940, when their branch of paratroopers, which they called the Fallschirmjäger, landed in Belgium and then in 1941 on the Greek island of Crete. The British would also use paratroopers in Italy. The declaration of war on Germany by the British is cited by most as symbolising the start of the Second World War in 1939. The Germans blitzed their way through Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium and into France. Initially, Germany and their allies would battle with Britain and their allies until Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Previously, the Germans and the Soviets had a political agreement with each other, but the agreement ended with the German invasion in 1941. The Soviets were able to resist the German invasion, but at a great cost to their nation. At this point, the Soviets started to fight back, and the British were also making advances against Germany's greatest European ally, Italy. This meant that the Germans were exhausting their resources in support of Italy, weakening their general situation. In the meantime, and on the other side of the world, there was an ongoing war between Japan and China. Japan was trying to expand their imperial influence over the Far East, including many Pacific islands. To sustain their war, the Japanese would also need oil, and there were significant supplies in the area in and around the East Indies. This was a huge concern for the United States, as it would interfere in their own interests in Pacific Islands, and Japan realised this, so they attacked the US fleet at Pearl Harbor to prevent the US from being able to interfere in the Japanese invasion of the East Indies and the Pacific. The similarities in the ideologies of Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan during the 1930s gave both nations a common cause in the world, and so they would develop a close political relationship. When Japan brought the United States into war, there was a realisation that there were two fundamental ideologies at war with each other. The nationalist, aggressive revisionists of the Axis powers such as Germany and Spain, against the imperial capitalists of the Allied powers such as the UK and the US. The US felt obliged to declare war against Germany to prevent the Axis powers from gaining more power and subsequently isolating the USA in world politics, causing further damage to the country. Even before the United States were brought into the Second World War by Japan, a United States Army Airborne School had been opened. The school would be geared specifically for training paratroopers. The training would involve learning to land safely. Often this could be emulated by jumping from a moving road vehicle. The school would acquire 250-foot tall towers from the New York World's Fair exhibition to enable the recruits to familiarise themselves with the activation of parachutes while falling through the air. Finally, the recruits would experience the real thing by jumping from an aircraft. The troops that completed the airborne school training would go into regiments of the US Army, and those regiments may be commissioned to serve in divisions that may be called into action on the various theatres of war. In 1942, the 506th Infantry Regiment was activated, and specifically it would be a parachute regiment. It was one of a number of parachute regiments, but the troops of the 506th Regiment completed all of their basic training and jump school training together, with the ethos being that this would bring them together as a family with considerable solidarity. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sink of the US Army, and the regiment would be split into 9 companies, each comprising of several dozen troops. The companies would be lettered from A to I, with the Army's specific phonetic alphabet being used to name them, hence the reason why E Company is known as Easy Company. Easy Company has been immortalised in modern media thanks to a book written by the American historian Stephen E. Ambrose in 1992 called Band of Brothers. The famous American filmmakers Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg used the book as the basis of a 2001 miniseries of the same name.
Training.
Robert Sink was born in Lexington, North Carolina in the United States in 1905. He graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1927. He served in Puerto Rico and the Philippines as well as the USA before the Second World War. In 1940, he joined the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment of the US Army, where he trained to the highest possible level, the Master Parachutist. He was put in command of the 503rd Infantry Regiment before he was put in command of the 506th Infantry Regiment. Sink was determined to make his regiment the best regiment of all. The regiment would undergo training at Camp Toombs in the US state of Georgia, but Sink felt that the name Toombs was a bad omen and applied for the name to be changed. It was changed to Camp Toccoa. Camp Toccoa was situated a couple of miles northwest of the Currahee Mountain, and troops would be put through their paces by being sent up and down the rocky mountain passes. If a recruit was not fit enough to complete the Currahee Mountain course, then the training could go no further for them. Sink's regime was a hard one, designed to get the absolute best from each and every individual. He made the men from his regiment endure a hard march in wintry conditions from Camp Toccoa to the city of Atlanta in full uniform. Almost everyone completed the march, including officers. The troops were seemingly inspired by the knowledge that they were training for a purpose, to aid in the defeat of the Nazi German dictator Adolf Hitler. They shared this test of endurance which would bring the troops of the regiment closer together as they shared the burden of carrying individual heavy weapons. After this, the troops would be transferred over to Fort Benning, which was officially renamed Fort Moore in May 2023. Fort Benning was the site of the 250-foot tall towers that had been moved from the 1939 New York World Fair exhibition, with the intention of the troops practicing their jumps from the top of the towers. The training was still intense, with a great mental stress caused. The initial jumps would take place from smaller towers before advancing to the largest ones. After training from the towers was completed, it would be on to the real thing. Troops would be taken in the air in sticks of up to 20 men and would follow a highly regimented process before launching themselves in very quick succession from the aircraft. It was imperative that the process was quick to ensure that the troops could land in close proximity to each other. Any trainee who froze before jumping was disqualified from paratrooper training with no second chances. Any parachute failures could be rescued using the reserve parachute strapped to the chest. Those who graduated from the entire school were presented with their jump wings, which was a silver parachutist's badge, and were allowed to wear their jump boots to distinguish them from other army troops.
The call to war.
When the parachute regiments first started to be established in 1940, the United States had no intention of going to war in Europe or going to war with Japan. There was a pressure on the United States to state their opinion on the war, but the country's population could generally be separated into two groups of people. Isolationists believed that it was in America's best interest to avoid involvement in the Second World War for all of the obvious reasons. It wasn't their war, and it would be a waste of lives, resources, and money. The interventionists, also called the internationalists, would fear the wider repercussions of American inactivity, fearing that nations such as Germany and Japan, if victorious, could adversely affect and threaten American global interests and trade relationships. Initially, isolationism was favoured by most Americans, but with the advent of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Americans felt more of a duty and an obligation to redirect the balance of power in the Pacific and also in Europe due to a heightened naval activity in the Atlantic Ocean threatening US interests. Easy Company and all the other companies of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment were called to join the 101st Airborne Division, otherwise known as the Screaming Eagles. They would be joined by other regiments, battalions and special troops. They would be gathered in New York City, ready to set sail for the United Kingdom, so they would know that their theatre of war would be Europe instead of the Pacific. Easy Company, and many others in the division, would be crammed in their thousands on the Samaria, a British ocean liner that was built for the purpose of transporting just 20% of the people who actually went on this journey. The parachuters were not allowed to wear their jump boots throughout this process, as the information of paratrooper involvement could not be known to the enemy. The Samaria was joined by dozens of other troop ships as they cautiously crossed the Atlantic, avoiding raising the suspicions of German submarines in the ocean. The journey to the UK on the British troop ship took approximately 12 days. The journey was uncomfortable in cramped conditions. The men would either have to sleep on the open decks or two to a bunk. Many of the men had to endure cold showers, and those that didn't would make life uncomfortable for their colleagues by becoming very smelly. The British food was unfamiliar to the American stomach, and doubtlessly with the undulation of the ocean waves, this could result in some of the food not staying in the stomach for very long. Upon arrival in England, Easy Company would be stationed at Aldbourne, a village in the English county of Wiltshire, and they would remain there for a number of months. Since their original training back in Georgia at Camp Toccoa, Easy Company's captain was a man called Herbert Sobel. Right from the start it appears that Sobel was a strict disciplinarian, which would have had a positive effect on the discipline of the troops. Sobel was determined that his company be the best company in the regiment. When Easy Company were about to be sent to the UK, Sobel wrote a letter to the mother of each of the troops. They were letters of encouragement sent to lift the spirits of the anxious parents and to remind them of how well prepared their sons were for battle, how proud the United States would be of their sons, and how they can support their sons by writing letters frequently. Sobel would tell the mothers that their sons could not possibly fail. However, despite being a strict disciplinarian, Sobel would also come across as a man who would look for any excuse to punish his troops. While other companies were relaxing, Sobel would have his men marching, and he would deny his men the simple comforts of a drink of water if they felt dehydrated during the march. Undoubtedly, in Sobel's mind, he would be toughening his men up to be an elite unit capable of maximum endurance, but this also made the troops resent him, as they wondered why he needed to be that much harder on them than other captains were on their companies. Things became worse in England as Sobel conducted training exercises with Easy Company, but demonstrated an inability to lead his men effectively. He was criticised for being too noisy while conducting exercises through woodland and losing his bearings, leading the men into potentially dangerous circumstances. The resentment turned into a lack of confidence. The straw that broke the camel's back was when Sobel punished his second in command, the generally popular Lieutenant Dick Winters, for arriving late for an inspection. Winters insisted that Sobel had given him the incorrect time and demanded a trial by courts-martial. The company sergeants wrote to the regiment's Colonel Robert Sink with an intent to resign in support of Winters. These letters during wartime could have been enough to have the sergeants punished in the harshest possible manner for treason, and although Sink needed to make an example of the sergeants, he also recognised the negative effect that Sobel was creating within many of Easy Company, something that he could ill afford to allow to continue. So Sink demoted the sergeants and transferred Sobel to a training camp, removing him from command.
The Normandy Landings.
The Normandy landings, also very commonly called the D-Day landings, were the first actions of the wider Operation Overlord, which was the invasion of Normandy in northern France, which at the time was under the control of Nazi Germany. This large-scale operation had been planned for around an entire year and had to be accompanied by well-planned decoy operations to confuse Nazi Germany about where and when the invasion was coming. It was now June 1944 and Easy Company had already moved from Aldbourne southwest to the Apottery airfield, so they would know that their involvement in the war was imminent. Easy Company had been in England since the late summer of 1943, when they had arrived from the United States. During the springtime of 1943, Easy Company learned that they would be joining the 101st Airborne Division, so the invasion across the English Channel and the wider Operation Overlord had been over a year in the planning. D-Day was 6th of June 1944. The timing was carefully selected due to the requirements for a full moon and a high tide. The United States landings were conducted alongside British and Canadian landings, collectively on 5 beaches of the Normandy coast. The paratroopers of Easy Company would have been loaded onto Douglas C-47 Skytrains, an aircraft originally constructed as a commercial liner, now being used for military transport. The noise of the aircraft prevented conversation, so each man was left to his own thoughts, wondering what on earth his fate would be on that day. On approach to the beach, German artillery opened fire on the aircraft, causing the pilots to fly erratically. Bullets piercing the aircraft only accelerated the paratroopers' desire to jump, and as soon as they could, they did. The moon was full and the tide was high, but visibility was poor. The visibility, coupled with the erratic piloting of aircraft coming under fire, meant that many of the paratroopers were dropped outside of their intended zone. Some would be dropped into marshland, where their heavily laden uniforms would cause them to drown. Others would not even have time to open their parachutes, leaving them to plummet to their deaths. Paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division and their fellow American 82nd Airborne Division attempted to land paratroopers at a strategical point called Utah Beach, the westernmost of 5 strategical drop points. Utah Beach was on the east side of the Cotentin Peninsula. Easy Company would be among those dropped there, and they would be assigned to the aircraft numbered 66 to 73. These would be referred to as sticks because they contained 17 paratroopers each. With Herbert Sobel's transfer, the command of Easy Company had been transferred to First Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, who travelled in Stick 66. Stick 66 came under fire from German anti-aircraft guns, causing the aircraft to turn around, lose altitude, crash and explode, killing everyone on board, including Meehan. Those members of Easy Company who survived the drop were scattered over a large distance, and those who were not on a target had to link up with whoever they could and do whatever they needed to do to link up with the rest of the unit. Lieutenant Dick Winters had managed to link up with other American paratroopers. It had been identified that German gunfire towards Utah Beach was coming from a battery at Brécourt Manor Farm, around 3 miles inland. 4 German cannons were being manned and guarded by around 60 German soldiers, and Lieutenant Winters had been ordered to take it out. Winters and his men numbered just over 20, so they had to employ the element of surprise in order to overcome their significantly inferior numbers. Winters would successfully get access to one of the guns, and using a combination of TNT and a grenade down the barrel of the gun, would take it out. Winters and his team used the trenches to terrorise the panicking Germans and reach 2 of the remaining 3 guns, taking them both out before members of Dog Company, among others, took out the remaining gun. Winters acquired an invaluable map of German artillery positions in Normandy, and he would emerge as a military hero. The next objective was to take control of the town of Carenton. Carenton was around 8 miles inland from Utah Beach, and it would prove to be very difficult to take with plenty of German defence within the town. Such was the determination of the Americans that they were able to take the town and run the Germans out. Lieutenant Winters once again was at the forefront of the assault, motivating the men around him to continue the fight when the odds seemed stacked against them. A 3-day mission had taken 35 days, but more importantly for the Americans, it was successful. Easy Company were taken back to England by boat, and around half of their men, including their commander Thomas Meehan, had either been killed or injured. Winters was clearly the correct placement for Meehan, and so he received promotion on the 1st of July. Colonel Sink recommended that Winters receive the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded in the US. This decoration was given out very sparingly, so Winters received the next best decoration, the Distinguished Services Cross.
Operation Market Garden.
Between July and September of 1944, the Allies had used their foothold in Normandy, created by the Normandy landings, and managed to advance significantly against the Axis powers, who were defending their European gains on multiple fronts, with the Soviets advancing on their east and the Italians losing ground to the south. The Allies had secured most of France and Belgium by mid-September, when they planned their next major operation called Market Garden. The plan would be to advance into the Netherlands and push a salient into German-occupied territory. This salient would be expected to secure an area along the River Rhine, which would allow the Allies to make further incursions into the north of Nazi Germany itself. Paratroopers, including Easy Company, would be dropped into the Netherlands to secure a route for the land forces to advance from Belgium. The code name for the airborne forces was Market, and for the land forces was Garden. Around 40,000 paratroopers were dropped from Douglas C-47 Sky trains and associated gliders into the Netherlands. This time it was daytime and there was little in the way of German artillery, quite different from the experience of Normandy just 3 months earlier. Easy Company lost around half of its men during the Normandy campaign, so more newer troops had joined their ranks. Easy Company were involved in the liberation of the Dutch city of Eindhoven, which had been occupied by Nazi Germany for around 4 years. The citizens of Eindhoven received Easy Company and their comrades warmly. However, the capture of Eindhoven was just the beginning of the entire operation. The Netherlands is a land of canals and rivers, and the Germans were attempting to destroy bridges to stop the Allied advance, while British engineers quickly erected Bailey bridges to reopen waterway crossings. The original objective of Operation Market Garden was to secure crossings on the River Rhine, and the Allies failed to achieve that objective. Easy Company, alongside other companies, now found themselves in an area of the Netherlands called the Island, an area surrounded by rivers. In the same way that Captain Winters had bravely led the charge in the French town of Corentin, he would lead a charge against an elite group of German SS troops. The German SS, or Schutzstaffel, to give it its proper name, were a specialist military wing of Nazi Germany, entrusted with many tasks of military policing. Winters commanded his men to fix their bayonets and was at the forefront of the charge towards the 300 SS troops stationed behind an elevated road. Smoke grenades were used by Easy Company and their allies for cover, but at one point Winters found himself on his own and having to buy time before his colleagues were able to join him. At this point, Winters and his associates were able to open fire on the SS troops, forcing those who survived the onslaught to retreat. Once again, Winters had shown outstanding bravery and dedication to the cause. He had no right to be alive when assessing the risks that he had been willing to take at Brécourt Manor, Carentan and the island. His reward was another promotion. This time he would no longer be in charge of Easy Company. He would be involved with the command of the entire battalion. It would be a tough day for Winters to leave the day-to-day running of Easy Company, a group of men that he had developed a strong bond with, but he had certainly earned his privileges. Before the men of Easy Company were allowed to return back to the relative safety of France, there was the reality that the failure of Operation Market Garden to achieve its objective had resulted in many Allied troops becoming stranded in enemy territory north of the Rhine, where the Allies had failed to secure a crossing of. Around 8,000 Allied soldiers had been abandoned, with 3/4 of those becoming prisoners of war. Possibly around 1,500 of the remaining quarter were killed, while the remainder, around 500, had gone into hiding. The Allies planned to rescue those men, and one of the operations directly involved Easy Company. Operation Pegasus involved the rescue of over 100 men from the northern banks of the lower Rhine River in the Netherlands. The troops of Easy Company would paddle across the river to rendezvous with the escapees and bring them back to the safety of Allied-held territory. With Winters now away from the front line, Easy Company would be led by a man called Frederick Moose Heiliger. Easy Company successfully completed the rescue in 90 minutes.
Battle of the Bulge.
By the end of 1944, it became clear to Nazi Germany that they were losing ground on their eastern front to the Soviets at an alarming rate. The reality was that Nazi Germany needed to use all of its resources to try to resist the Soviet advance, but it wasn't able to do so while the Americans, the British and the Canadians were causing so many problems on the Western Front. Adolf Hitler had to realise that he needed to sue for peace on the Western Front, but would not be able to do that unless he could get the upper hand. So he would launch a major offensive into the heart of Allied occupied territory in Belgium, with the intention of capturing the port of Antwerp and separating and surrounding Allied regiments in the adjacent areas. Everything that had gone on before now between the United States and Nazi Germany had now reached a crescendo, as this seemed to be Hitler's last great roll of the dice against the American powerhouse invading its occupied territory. Nazi Germany would employ almost 500,000 men and much in the way of associated vehicles including tanks and artillery, as well as aircraft, to get the job done. The launch of the attack in December 1944 caught the Allies by surprise, and the Allies hurriedly attempted to fight back without any formal preparation. The Allies did not want to lose the recently liberated town of Bastogne, a Belgian town on the Luxembourgish border. So the 101st Airborne, including Easy Company, was sent to Bastogne to defend it. The strength of the Axis advance meant that Bastogne was very quickly surrounded, and the members of Easy Company were entrapped, having to endure relentless German gunfire as well as surviving in the harshest winter conditions with a limited supply of clothing and food. The battalion commander, Dick Winters, watched as Easy Company's newest captain, Norman Dyke, froze in the midst of gunfire while attempting to capture the nearby village of Foix. Winters wanted to take control as he did at Carentan, but his new role meant that he needed to stay in a position of command. So he sent the captain of Dog Company, Ronald Spears, to do as Winters himself would have done, and inspired the troops to press on with their objective despite the gunfire around them. Spears' incredible bravery not only allowed the 2nd Battalion, of which Winters was a member of, the commanding officers, to capture the village of Foix, but also defend the town of Bastogne. This display of resistance in these extreme conditions was pretty remarkable. The resistance at Bastogne denied the Germans an important road westwards, and this brought the Allies the time to recover from the initial shock of the German advance and prevent it from achieving its objectives. Bastogne was relieved from its siege by the American Third Army, and once again Easy Company had gone beyond the call of duty and affected the fortunes of the war in Europe.
The collapse of Nazi Germany.
As the Allies continued the aerial bombardment of important strategical German targets, it was clear that the progress of the Soviet army in the east and the Allies from the west and the south had taken the heart out of the German army. The Allies broke through into Germany beyond the Siegfried Line, which was the German wall along their western border. Easy Company were among those who marched onto German soil, accepting the surrender of masses of German troops as they travelled. Easy Company's objective was to head south to Bavaria and take control of the Eagle's Nest, which was a Nazi headquarters built on a summit in the Berchtesgaden Alps. Their route would take them alongside concentration camps in southern Germany. Dick Winters, now a major, would be informed by the men who discovered one such concentration camp containing emaciated and deceased humans. No German guards remained as they had fled before the Allies arrived. Major Winters informed Colonel Sink and through translation learned that the camp contained many Jews. Those who survived these desperately inhumane conditions would be liberated, but they were so malnourished that they could not simply be given food for fear that it could have a dangerous effect on their digestive systems. As the Allies closed in on the city of Berlin, Adolf Hitler would commit suicide on the 30th of April 1945. Easy Company would not be sent to Berlin, but instead to Bavaria and the mountain retreat of the elite Nazi German commanders, including Hitler himself. For the Americans, it would be a race against the French to secure the municipality of Berchtesgaden and claim the glory of the capture. Easy Company would be at the head of the American effort, and they successfully occupied Berchtesgaden and ascended to the mountain summit of Kielstein, where the Kielstein House, known to the Americans as the Eagle's Nest, was situated. It would not be long before it was learned that Nazi Germany had surrendered on the 7th of May, and the war in Europe was over. Easy Company could finally relax amidst the opulent building and the breathtaking landscape that was previously the luxury of Hitler himself. Easy Company would not be able to return home immediately. They would move into Austria to carry out important duties in the aftermath of the war. The members of Easy Company would be allowed to return home on an individual basis determined by a point system. So they would not all come home together, but by early 1946 much of the company had returned to America, with the 101st Airborne now decommissioned and Easy Company disbanded. Colonel Sink continued to serve in the American Army after returning to the United States after the Second World War. He would serve in the Korean War and also go to work in Brazil and Panama during the 1950s. He died of lung disease in 1965 at the age of 60. Herbert Sobel was the overzealous initial captain of Easy Company, who was so unpopular that he was replaced before the Normandy landings took place. Some say that Sobel's harsh treatment of the company was a contributing factor in bringing the members closer together in a feeling of solidarity against his oppressive regime. Sobel was honourably discharged from the United States Army after the war, before he too was recalled to take part in the Korean War in the 1950s. In 1970, Sobel attempted suicide by gunshot, but amazingly survived. The attempt did leave him blind, and he would stay alive until 1987, when he died of severe malnutrition at the age of 75. Some say that Sobel was not completely unlike other company captains in his harsh approach, and that media has depicted him in a very negative light, and that he was actually a very capable administrator among the army ranks. The last captain of Easy Company was Ronald Spears, who heroically helped to defend the Belgian town of Bastogne before being entrusted with the leadership of Easy Company. After the war, Spears would stay in the army, serving in the Korean War and having a number of postings before returning to work in the Pentagon, the building that is the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense, close to Washington, D.C. He retired in 1964 and lived until 2007, when he died at the age of 86. Dick Winters very much became disillusioned with warfare after everything that he accomplished with Easy Company and the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment during the Second World War. He had to remain in Germany after the end of the war for a number of months before he was allowed back to America. One of the more familiar faces that he knew from Easy Company was Captain Lewis Nixon. Nixon participated in the drops in Normandy and in the Netherlands, and his family were the creators of Nixon Nitration Works, a company that originally distributed gunpowder during the First World War. Winters managed to gain employment at Nixon's company. At the outbreak of the Korean War, the United States Army would try to enlist Winters, and he would do everything he could not to go. He had seen enough warfare. He did actually manage to avoid going to Korea. He was discharged from the army and went back to work at Nixon's. Later in life, Winters' contribution to the United States Army was not to be forgotten. His experiences would be recounted in works by himself and by others. Winters didn't view himself as a hero, but he viewed himself as someone who had worked alongside heroes. Winters suffered from Parkinson's disease in his later years, and he died at the age of 92 in 2011. Many of those in Easy Company shared their journey from Camp Toccoa to the Eagle's Nest, and their shared experiences were somewhat unique. Other companies did not necessarily train together, but the members of Easy Company did. Their shared experience of serving under the oppressive regime of Herbert Sobel had the effect of creating a bond of solidarity. The men of the company were already looking to Dick Winters for leadership and inspiration, and they greatly respected him. The men of Easy Company apparently took great risks for each other. Winters would fearlessly put himself in the line of fire in order to keep his men going and prevent them from becoming sitting ducks for the enemy. The story of their solidarity and success, often against the odds, has captured the attention and admiration of many who read of their success. They were best described as a brotherhood who shared experiences that even their own flesh and blood families could never relate to, quite like their company comrades could. The American historian Stephen E. Ambrose recognised this incredible bond between the members of Easy Company and interviewed many of the surviving members before writing the book of their experience, published in 1992, called Band of Brothers. Stephen E. Ambrose quoted William Shakespeare's words from his play Henry V at the conclusion of the story in his book. From this day to the ending of the world, we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Thank you very much for listening to this week's special episode of the podcast on the subject of Easy Company, and possibly the first, I believe, episode where we've concentrated everything on modern history, on the 20th century. So, I can't recall another time that we've done that. So, a shape of things to come going forward in the podcast, and thank you so much for listening. That episode was commissioned by a History of the World podcast Illuminati member. He's a good friend of the podcast called Terry Bain. So thank you very much to Terry for everything that he's done for the podcast, and also for picking such a great subject. Now, Terry qualified for that reward by becoming a member of the History of the World podcast Illuminati. Those are the people who support the podcast. And if you enjoy the podcast and want to support the podcast and even commission your own special episode, then visit our website and click on the Patreon link. And there you can sign up to make a monthly contribution. It really helps to make this podcast bigger and better. Really, all the support that has been given to this podcast over the years has brought it to where it is now, quite frankly. When you make a contribution towards the podcast, you will become a lifelong member of the History of the World podcast Illuminati, and you'll qualify not only to commission your own special episode once you've accrued the relevant amount, but also you'll get gifts posted to you as well from headquarters here. So come and have a look at what you can gain. You can also access some bonus material on there, but the best way to get it all in one place is to subscribe through Spotify. So if you get a subscription through Spotify, just click on the link in the podcast description wherever you listen to it, and you can get everything in one place there. Bonus material that is published most weeks. You get an extra 10-15 minutes just discussing the material of the episode that you've just listened to, as well as some of the source material that has been used. So why not come along, consider doing that. We've reduced the price of subscriptions, so now there's a great opportunity for you to come along and enjoy the extra material and an ad-free experience. So why not consider coming along and doing that.
Listener messages and reviews.
Last week's special episode was about the Elizabethan sea dogs, and this was a commissioned episode by History of the World podcast Illuminati member David Peace, who wrote in and just said thank you very much for last week's superb episode on the Elizabethan sea dogs and their swashbuckling exploits. The extra time and energy you dedicated to the effort is manifest and deeply appreciated. You adroitly set the stage and laid out the geopolitical context for the story. And then you focused the spotlights onto the dramatis personae and proceeded to unfurl the plot with dramatic finesse. Shakespeare, who was no doubt aware of the Sea Dog's daring deeds in real time, would have been impressed with your production. The Sea Dogs were men of remarkable character and genius. Their actions were very consequential for England's evolution into a global superpower. Thank you for packing so much information and commentary into the episode. I was particularly amused by your side comment about Sir Walter Raleigh's opus, The History of the World. I find Sir Walter's life and demise to be especially Shakespearean in character. The courage and equanimity with which he approached the chopping block is a story for the ages. Here is how another great historian, David Hume, recounts the final moments. Raleigh, finding his fate inevitable, collected all his courage, and though he had formerly made use of many mean artifices, such as feigning madness, sickness, and a variety of diseases, in order to protract his examination and procure his escape, he now resolved to act his part with bravery and resolution. "'Tis a sharp remedy," he said, "but a sure one for all ills," when he felt the edge of the axe by which he was to be beheaded. His harangue to the people was calm and eloquent, and he endeavoured to revenge himself and to load his enemies with the public hatred by strong asseverations of facts which, to say the least, may be esteemed very doubtful. With the utmost indifference he laid his head on the block and received the fatal blow, and in his death there appeared the same great but ill-regulated mind which, during his life, had displayed itself in all his conduct and behaviour, from the history of England, from Julius Caesar to the glorious Revolution. Again, thanks for taking on this topic. You are building a great legacy. Keep up the good work. Kind regards, David Peace. David, thank you so much for everything you do for the podcast. This is my gift to you because of your kindness towards the project. So you've earned this privilege, and thank you so much. Now, very important announcement. A couple of announcements really, but very important. This coming Saturday, the 24th of June, is the podcast's 5th birthday. So we're fast approaching the beginning of our 6th year of production. So way back on the 24th of June 2018, we published our first episode. So we're 5 years in. And for those of you who've been along for the whole journey, very well done indeed. Also coming up, as usual, in June, I go to the Chalk Valley History Festival. So if you're in England and thinking about going, I'll be there on the Thursday and the Friday. So do be sure to let me know if you're there, and I'll buy you a pint for sure. And then we'll have a little chat about the History of the World podcast and what interests you about history. We can have a little chat maybe. So do let me know. Do let me know if you're going to be there. And, I'll be sure to try and say hello to you. Anyway, thank you very much. Stephen Williams, I haven't forgotten about you. You sent me an email last month, and I'm preparing to answer your questions. So if you're listening, Stephen, don't worry. I'm not ignoring you. I've just got it on the back burner while I consider my response to your question. So we'll all find out more about that at a later date. Now we've got 2 more special episodes left to publish before we resume Volume 4 properly and start talking about medieval India, Japan, China, Korea, all of that, amongst other things that will come later on, even the Pacific Islands, the Americas, of course. Yeah, quite a lot coming up. But before we do all of that, there are 2 special episodes still left to go. The first one is on the history of Thailand. So we're going to look at the entire country's history in one episode. That's always a challenge. And secondly, the history of history, which we call historiography. So that will be something completely different. So look forward to those in the coming weeks. But thanks ever so much for listening. And until next time, be good.
The History of the World podcast, written and presented by Chris Hasler. Please consider making a financial contribution by going to the historyoftheworldpodcast.com website and clicking on the Patreon link. Email the show at historyoftheworldpodcast@mail.com. And don't forget to join our social media at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Tumblr. See you next time.